Chapter 5 Weaver led the way through the desolate, ruinous remains of Los Angeles and navigated with ease the way out through the outskirts. The damage had tapered off the further they got from the downtown area that had been ground zero for one of the several warheads 3 or 4 by Weaver's estimation that had flattened much of LA County. And the residential areas further out were a hive of almost structurally intact detached and semi-detached homes set out in neat square blocks. Weaver knew that because the residential areas of the city on the outskirts hadn't been so heavily damaged by the blasts, that they'd also been the scenes of some of the most aggressive fighting between human forces and Skynet at some point. They passed the long, burnt-out remains of several tanks, Humvees and armored personnel carriers, abandoned or destroyed, she estimated, in the early years of the war, before what had been left of the world's military forces had been obliterated and the survivors scattered. The scenes of old battles were clear to John Henry, too, walking behind Weaver and scanning the area for any signs of life. There were none. They fled their homes, Cameron explained to him. They were safer underground. She knew that people who lived above ground after Judgment Day tended not to survive very long. As if to prove her point, an HK flew out in the distance, casting a searchlight down onto the ground several miles away. John Henry listened, knowing Cameron had a wealth of knowledge to provide him, but his primary thoughts were elsewhere, focused in an endless loop. Why did you kill them? They were a threat, Weaver replied simply. She didn't turn around, but instead morphed and changed, her back becoming her front and vice versa, so that she was facing them. I won't let anything harm you. Why the child? John Henry asked with a hint of accusation in his voice. He could perfectly recall Weaver's blade slicing open little Grace's throat, the rich red arterial blood spurting from the severed carotid, and the girl collapsing to the ground, gasping and clutching desperately at her neck as she bled out into a gaping puddle on the cold ground. She couldn't have been a threat to them. It seemed wrong to him. They weren't a threat. Weaver stared at him, her expression unchanging in the least. If we'd let them go, they'd have told others, who would have come after you. Humans can be very dangerous, John Henry. Remember that. John Henry knew that wasn't true. So did Cameron. Rick and Tony had told them they weren't in contact with anyone else. They survived alone. Weaver led them to an empty street, lined on both sides by large, detached houses. She walked up to a dusty Jeep Cherokee and looked back at John Henry. Get in. She opened the door and took the driver's seat, whilst John Henry climbed into the passenger seat next to her. Weaver drove off out of the city, picking her way through the deserted and litter-strewn streets devoid of any signs of life, human, animal, or machine. The signs of past firefights went past in a blur, and John Henry stared out the window and watched the endless landscape destruction caused by his brother. Would you have killed them? John Henry asked Cameron. I would have killed Rick and Tony. They shot us. What about the others? They weren't a threat. Cameron remembered Sarah, saying they didn't kill for the sake of it. John's mother had tried to emphasize that they didn't take lives unless they had to. What she hadn't understood was that Terminators didn't kill for nothing, either. Every human she'd killed had been either a direct or indirect threat to John. The men she'd killed in the tunnel before had also been a threat. She'd seen evidence of a military encampment in the tunnels. The men she'd killed would have been allied with them, would have warned them about a machine nearby. Weaver's very protective of you. I understand why she did it. John Henry sat in silence for several seconds, an eternity, to an AI that could process more information in a moment than a human could in a lifetime. He still didn't understand the need for Weaver to kill them. Cameron recognized they weren't a threat. There was no need to kill them, but Weaver had done anyway. John Henry had detailed files of everything recorded in the Zyra Corp building, dating to even before he had become aware. He knew that an executive called Richard Hack had openly opposed Weaver's Project Babylon. Soon after that, he had disappeared. He'd perused the internet and found no trace of Richard Hack, much the same as he'd never found any evidence of other employees at new locations or in new jobs. They'd all been an inconvenience to Project Babylon, and they'd all disappeared. Cameron eliminated threats, but Weaver seemed to consider any minor inconvenience to her plans as a threat that should be dealt with. To John Henry, killing those people wasn't eliminating a threat or protecting him, it was murder. As they drove, he saw even more scenes of battle all around them, counting over 130 burnt-out and shattered tanks and armored vehicles, plus scores of Humvees and military trucks. The twisted, blackened front end of an AH-64 Apache attack helicopter stuck out from the crumbling ruins of a house, which it appeared to have crashed onto. The battle hadn't been entirely one-sided. There were several ruined hulks of Skynet's earlier autonomous tanks and aircraft scattered around, but John Henry estimated from what he'd seen so far that 11 manned vehicles had been destroyed for every one machine. The number of human deaths was incalculable. John Henry had partial access to Cameron's memories. He was extremely efficient at perusing, as he'd found whilst searching the internet for anything and everything of interest. And although they remained separate entities on her chip, the distinct line between them blurred in some places and allowed him to see into her memories, to an extent. He saw a perfect recall of her assault on the county jail, how she'd gone out of her way to not kill any humans. She'd suffered for it. He could sense the damage reports flooding in as if they were happening to him. She could have prevented such extensive damage by using lethal force, but she'd chosen not to. She could have killed 26 men and women, but instead had only wounded 8. He could access these memories as to what she'd done, but her reasons for doing so eluded him. John wouldn't have wanted me to kill them, she explained. Killing them wasn't necessary to rescue Sarah. It would have been easier, John Henry responded. He was unsure of why Weaver had killed so callously and without thought, yet Cameron had chosen, at a heavy cost to herself, to preserve lives that he knew meant nothing to her. Only John's did. They weren't a threat to John, she repeated. John Henry found that strange. They weren't a threat to John Connor, but they'd still been a threat to her. He knew from the memories he'd accessed that the cumulative effects of the damage she'd previously sustained prior to the event, plus the several hundred rounds she'd taken attacking the jail, had damaged her. She'd have known she'd be damaged, to the point where she wouldn't be able to function properly or blend into the human population, making her an obvious target for his brother and people working with him. She hadn't thought long-term, which surprised him. "You knew you were going to leave, John," he stated. Cameron made no reply. She didn't need to. He was right. As soon as she'd heard the words, "Will you join us?" she'd known what she had to do. John's best chance was for her to protect John Henry. The AI could help John win the war in the future, and in the meantime Sarah, James Ellison, and Catherine Weaver would have been able to protect John. "Where's John?" Cameron took over the body and asked the liquid metal Terminator. Why hadn't the humans you killed heard of him? Had something happened to him? "You're John's cyborg," Weaver replied, slightly surprised at the revelation. "I want to thank you," she said, "for taking John Henry to the future and out of Kaliba's reach." "Where's John?" Cameron repeated insistently. "I don't know. I left him in the tunnels beneath Zyracorp with the human soldiers. One of them looked like you, 715. You left John." Cameron glared at Weaver, and her fists clenched. John Henry kept in the background and watched through his own eyes as he sensed Cameron's anger growing. "Yes," Weaver replied simply and drove onwards. "I wouldn't have been welcome among the humans. John is safer without me there. Why hasn't anyone heard of him?" Cameron repeated her previous question. He should be fighting Skynet. That was why she took John Henry to the future, to give John a better chance against Skynet in the future. John wasn't there to fight Skynet, she told Cameron. I came through the TDE to find John Henry. John came with me to find you. Weaver turned her head back to the road to indicate the conversation was over, and they continued on in silence. The Cherokee drove out of the city, leaving the residential area behind as they turned out onto the remains of the highway and continued on into the desert. They carried on, completely alone and unchallenged into the sparse, desolate plains of the Mojave Desert. John Henry noted the stark contrast between the utter destruction and devastation of the city to the pristine, untouched wilderness of the desert. He theorized that there must be several groups of humans who must live out in the desert. They'd be safer in the desert than in the cities. He knew it would be better to avoid any camps for the sake of the occupants. While Weaver drove, Cameron thought about John. Why had he come to the future? Why had Weaver brought him through? Where are we going? John Henry took over the body once more and asked. Both AI were finding the experience of sharing a body and sharing control over it to be very strange. I found something, Weaver responded. She turned left on a small dirt road that led off the highway and deeper into the desert, and past several ancient-looking signs that informed them they were entering a restricted area, a U.S. Air Force bombing range. As they drove on, a large, solitary structure appeared in the desert range. John Henry zoomed in as much as he could and identified the building as an aircraft hangar. It grew larger as they approached, and within minutes loomed over them as Weaver pulled the car to a stop. Both machines stepped out and towards the mammoth hangar that dwarfed the two machines, easily 50 feet high and as long as 2 football fields. The walls were worn gunmetal gray and showed signs of rust, but the structure itself appeared solid. Cameron noted that the large doors were already partially open, just wide enough to fit a single man inside. She picked up the M14 rifle she'd taken from one of the men Weaver killed and held it out at the ready, John Henry's finger on the trigger. Its 7.62mm rounds would be hard-pressed to penetrate an Endo's armored chassis, even at point-blank range, but she knew the weak points her body had shared in common with T-888s. Multiple direct shots fired in close quarters to knee, hip, or elbow joints could damage them enough to give her an advantage. A wordless, silent agreement passed between Cameron and John Henry that she would retain control of the body until the hangar was secure. Nobody's here, Weaver told them. It's been abandoned since Judgment Day. What's in here? Cameron asked as she entered through the gap in the hangars. Weaver didn't answer straight away and let the sight before them explain it all. Spread out through the hangar before the cyborgs were a large number of UCAVs, X-45C and X-47 Pegasus drones. 24 unmanned combat aerial vehicles sat gathering dust inside the hangar, left since the start of the war and completely forgotten about by either side. Cameron gave John Henry back control, and the younger AI stepped forward and looked around at the sleek drones, impressed at the machines humans had made. These were the predecessors for the machine Skynet used in its war against mankind. Weaver gestured with one hand to the UCAVs in the hangar. This is the start of your resistance. We have a lot of work to do, so we should begin immediately. Sarah pushed hard on the gas and sped the car down the road. The speedometer held just a hair above the limit, despite Sarah's instinct to gun the engine for everything it had. Air whistled through the bullet holes in their windscreen and created a draft in the front of the truck that blew into her face. Turn left here, Ellison instructed her. Sarah nodded and pulled the truck on the next left, then pulled to a stop outside a dirty-looking used car dealership. The sign above the store read Sal's Quality Used Cars. One look at the place told Sarah that quality wasn't something they were going to get here. A rusting black VW Beetle sat next to 72 red Ford Grand Torino that probably hadn't seen a day's proper maintenance since it rolled off the assembly line. A number of sedans and 4 X4s of varying age populated the concrete forecourt, their conditions ranging between some work needed to rust in peace. She could see what Ellison was thinking. Who the hell would buy a car here? She felt some shame that before events in Red Valley had forced them to carry on their fight against Skynet, she'd been saving up to buy a car for John's 16th birthday and would have done so from a place precisely like this. She'd have loved to have bought him something nicer, but Benga, single mother, and working as a waitress, had never brought the kind of cash she'd need to have her son keeping up with the Joneses. There'd been another reason, too, however. Places like this always take cash, and they don't ask a lot of questions, Sarah told Ellison. Let me out here, she added. Go in, look around, and keep the staff occupied. Where are you going? Ellison asked as Sarah opened the passenger side door and stepped out. She closed the door behind her, then leaned back in through the open window. Errands, she said simply, then turned away. She heard Ellison breathe a slight sigh as he pulled off and turned into the forecourt. Sarah walked casually past the dealership, a wife getting out of the car to go shopping whilst her husband looked for a new car. It was believable enough, she thought. Sarah's eyes darted back and forth constantly, continuously scanning every single person she saw in the street. She walked casually down the street and held her cell phone to her ear. She started chattering away to an imaginary girlfriend, a big smile on her face, but her eyes were busy. She watched a young couple walking a collie and scrutinized them carefully. Do you have a trigger on me? They were holding hands, smiling and chatting to each other. She watched them further, checked their eyes. They're looking at each other, not me. The dog's nuzzling his thigh, it knows him. Sarah looked away and felt a slight relief. They were just a young couple out for a walk with their dog, either that, or they were damn good, dog and all. Sarah turned round the corner of the block, and she spotted another potential target. A gray-haired old man in gray trousers and a thin beige jacket over a white shirt and brown tie stood by a bus stop sign and smoking a cigarette. Again, she discreetly observed him as she approached. She got closer and tried to check him out without making eye contact if he was looking out for her. Then the last thing she wanted was for him to know she was onto him. He was an old boy, maybe 70, his hair thinning on top but still just about covering at least some of his head, and thick glasses. She was so close now she could smell the smoke from his cigarette. Who are you? You old bastard, police, feds, Kaliba. She risked eye contact at the last moment and saw that the old man was looking straight at her. He turned towards her and reached his hand down into his jacket pocket. Shit. She giggled into the phone and smiled brightly, this time chatting to her nice new boyfriend about dinner that evening, but her hand slid behind her to the back of her jeans. Her fingers slowly wrapped around the handle of her Glock. Sarah jumped in shock as the bus rolled to a stop just behind her and hissed loudly. The old man pulled out a bus pass and walked straight past her to the opening door. Get a grip, Sarah, she told herself. She'd come a second away from pulling out a gun on an innocent old man in a very public spot. So much for being inconspicuous, she thought. She'd been so focused on the old man, she hadn't even had the bus. That was sloppy. Sarah eventually found what she was looking for. With the blackout still unresolved, all the supermarkets would have closed for health and safety reasons. She was looking for somewhere smaller. She quickly found a convenience store that was open. A hastily drawn handwritten sign was placed in the glass of the entrance announcing that, because of the blackout, they were only taking cash. She stepped inside and was instantly grateful that the interior of the store was dimmed considerably thanks to the lights being off. She couldn't see any other customers, but she spotted an old Chinese woman sat at the counter, reading a magazine. Sarah made her way through the aisles and pretended to browse, though she knew very well exactly what she wanted. She picked up a bottle of blonde hair dye, a comb, a hairband, a pair of sunglasses, and a pair of cheap reading glasses. She took her items to the counter and pulled out a $20 bill from her pocket as the old lady wrote down the prices on a notepad, in lieu of the cash register being off from the lack of power. The old lady said a price, but Sarah barely heard it. She handed over a $20 bill and waited for her change. Leaving without it would look suspicious, she knew. "You no want blonde," the Chinese woman said in heavily accented, broken English as she handed over the change. "Too many blondes." She shook her head and waved her hand outwards, gesturing at the world at large. Sarah smiled and thanked the old lady, then casually left the store. Outside, she put on the sunglasses, tied her hair back into a loose ponytail, and carried on down the street, taking note of each store. The whole area was practically deserted. Nobody bothered to go out shopping when the stores were all closed. Sarah found what she was looking for eventually, a small clothing outlet, closed of course, and with nobody in sight. Perfect. Sarah pulled out her Glock, held it by the barrel, and smashed the handle on one of the glass of the front door, cracking it in a spider's web pattern. She brought down the gun again on the glass, and the second time it smashed completely. Sarah stuck her hand through the hole in the smashed pane and opened the door, then let herself inside. Sarah figured that if the blackout lasted more than a couple of hours, people would start looting anyway. She was just setting the trend. She looked nervously at the CCTV camera in the corner of the store. Even though she knew the power was off, the sight of a camera made her worried. Down to business, Sarah thought. She needed to change her appearance, and that included some new sets of clothes, having left everything she'd owned behind. She looked at the vast racks of clothes: jeans, tops, skirts, jackets, shoes, hats, handbags, and swallowed with mild dread as she prepared to undertake something other women loved but she herself abhorred: shopping. "She's a beauty, ain't she, sir?" the salesman said with a practiced smile as Ellison casually pretended to be interested in a used silver Mercedes C-Class. Ellison looked at the car, 8 to 10 years old, he reckoned. It looked in good shape, much better than most of the cars on the lot, and Ellison had an inkling that this one hadn't come to them by honest means. Whether the salesman had any clue of that or not, he didn't know and didn't care. Chances were if it was stolen, it had probably been repainted and had its plates changed. "I don't know," Ellison said uncertainly. "She's nice, but I prefer to buy American." "I know what you mean," the salesman replied, the grin not letting up for an instant. Ellison briefly wondered if he practiced holding the grin for a long time in front of a mirror. The salesman, his badge identified him as Chris gestured to the blue F-150 to the left of the Mercedes. This was what Ellison had been interested in. He wasn't particularly fond of 4x4s, but Sarah was, and they could use the extra space for supplies. Plus, since Weaver, John, and John Henry had gone to the future, thoughts of Sarah's Pescadero rants about Judgment Day had come to mind. If they couldn't stop it, they'd never be safe in the city. They'd need an off-road vehicle to hide out in the desert. Ellison realized he'd unwittingly conscripted himself to Sarah's cause, but he wouldn't turn back now. He knew now just how much was at stake, and he'd do whatever he could to make sure it never happened. "Come on, Sarah," Ellison muttered quietly. She'd been gone for nearly half an hour, 20 minutes since she called him, and he didn't know how much longer he could browse around these cars without arousing suspicion from the salesman. "Tell me about it," he told Chris. "Well, it's 6 years old, one previous owner who took good care of it, by the way. Only 38,000 miles on the clock. She's fully serviced, comes with a 1-year guarantee from us." Ellison maintained an even expression as he tuned out the asinine sales pitch. He really didn't care about the car's history. as long as he could buy it now and not have it on any record. Full air conditioning, leather seats, power windows, the works, Chris carried on. Ellison looked into the car, if only to hide his look of impatience and aggravation from Chris. He'd never been fond of salesmen. Something about them pushing their wares on a person, trying their hardest to part people from as much money as possible, didn't sit right with Ellison. And considering that, for the last half an hour, Chris had harangued him relentlessly, apparently smelling a sale like a shark did blood, and was circling around, unable to resist trying to make every car in the lot seem like it were a Ferrari straight out of the showroom. Ellison shook his head slightly, unable to take any more sales pitches. "I'll take this one." He tapped his knuckles on the F-150's hood. "How much?" Chris pursed his lips and sucked, as if he was about to break some bad news. $1,500, he said. Ellison cocked an eyebrow at him, curious. The car, while used, was surely worth twice that amount, at least. It had to have been stolen, or had something wrong with it he didn't want them to know about. Either that, or Sal's quality cars had hit some serious hard times. "Sure," Ellison said as he pulled his wallet out. Chris shook his head vigorously at the sight of his wallet. "Whoa, we're not set up for plastic, friend. Power's out anyway. The lights aren't even on in the office. Cash or check, I'm afraid." "I can do that." Ellison reached into his suit's breast pocket and pulled out his checkbook. Chris led the way into the office, and he followed, noticing how dim it was inside. The door slammed shut behind Ellison, revealing Sarah holding her gun in both hands, pointed straight at Chris's head. He noticed she'd changed clothes, too. The black leather jacket and tank top were gone, instead replaced by a pale blue simple t-shirt. There were bags on the floor full of more clothes. "Hands up," Sarah snarled. Chris's hands shot skyward before she'd even finished speaking. "Okay, lady. Cash drawers behind the desk there. Just take it, I won't stop you." "I don't want your money," she snapped, moving closer to him. Chris looked at her as if she'd grown another head. He'd expected her to rob him, thought Ellison was part of it. Now he saw the man didn't have his hands up and didn't look the slightest bit afraid. Confused, yes, but definitely not afraid. "Who are you working for?" "What?" "I work here, Sal's." "What are you doing, Sarah?" Ellison asked. He was shocked as hell to even see her in the office. He hadn't noticed her approaching the dealership. No wonder we never caught her, he thought to himself. She's good. I heard him through the open window. $1,500 for a car that's worth a lot more. Why's this place even open, anyway? There's a blackout. Everywhere is closed. Who is it? The police, the feds, who? No way could this just be an honest business to Sarah. She didn't believe it for a second. She deliberately didn't mention Kaliba, just in case he was. She didn't want them to know she was aware of them. She watched his face like a hawk and studied him for any signs of deceit, but she couldn't see any. "I'm not working for the cops, I swear." Chris was practically shaking now. The fear in his eyes was plain for anyone with eyes to see, but it wasn't enough for Sarah. She swept out one hand with the Glock still in it and smacked the barrel against his brow, knocking him to the ground. "Please, I'm not working for the cops, I'm just a salesman." Chris got up onto his knees and looked up in fear at Sarah. A trickle of blood ran down to his eyes from a gash on his forehead where the gun had struck, but he didn't dare wipe it away. Sarah held the gun in Chris's face and watched impassively as tears ran from his eyes. "Sarah," Ellison frowned at her. "We're not murderers." "It's self-defense." She glared back at Ellison as she held the weapon steady and took up first pressure on the trigger. "Please, for God's sake, I'm just a salesman." Sarah saw a wet patch appear on the crotch of his trousers. She shook her head and lowered the gun. "I believe you," she finally said. No matter how good an actor a cop, fed, or someone from Kaliba might be. She didn't think they'd deliberately piss themselves. Get up. Chris nodded and slowly rose, shaking to his feet. Give me the keys for the Mercedes. Chris went over to a small cupboard and opened it up, revealing 24 sets of car keys inside. He picked up one with a fob that bore the Mercedes emblem and handed it over to Sarah. This stolen? She asked. Wait a minute, is this car stolen? Chris hung his head and nodded sullenly. I've never seen any paperwork for it, so I'm guessing so. Yeah. I never asked any questions. Good, Sarah replied. Are the plates the original ones? Chris shook his head no, and Sarah smiled in satisfaction. Here's what we're gonna do. We're going to get our things out of the Ram, put them into the Mercedes, and drive off. We're not stealing it. The Ram's yours. Straight swap. Got that. You should thank us. You can sell the Dodge for a lot more. Sarah glanced around the office, and another thought came to her. Give me your cell phone, she told him. Chris obliged, reached into his pocket and handed it over. Sarah put it in her pocket, then ripped the cord out of the office phone on the desk. Turn around. Chris once again did, as he was told, but he couldn't help himself from letting out a small whimper. They were going to execute him, he knew it. Sarah pulled back her arm and swung the pistol once more, smashing against Chris's skull with a wet smack. He dropped to the floor in an instant, and Ellison quickly knelt down beside him, pressing his fingers against Chris's neck, checking for a pulse. He's alive, he nodded to Sarah. Ellison maneuvered Chris's unconscious body into the recovery position as Sarah disassembled the cell phone. Chris had admitted that the Mercedes was stolen. Where one car was hot, chances were there were others on their lot. He wouldn't be likely to have called the cops, and he didn't seem to recognize her, but Sarah Connor wasn't one for taking any chances. You're better off not knowing where we go, Sarah said to the unconscious Chris. Let's go, she nodded at Ellison. We're done here. Sarah stood in the basement of Ellison's house and ran her hand through her newly blonde hair. She'd trimmed it by a few inches, too, and now had it tied up in a loose ponytail. With either the glasses or the sunglasses, it would hide her well from the casual observer, and she'd bought a couple of hats to hide her from any CCTV when the power was finally restored. She looked down at the body laid out in the cinder block pit she and the former agent had made. Cameron lay completely still, and Sarah would have said she looked peaceful, but for the multitude of bullet wounds that perforated her flesh, and the fact that half her face was missing, exposing a large portion of gunmetal gray endoskull and the dull orb of her left eye. Sarah peered closer at her face, inspecting it carefully. She could have sworn that some of the skin had already started to heal, if only very slightly. Could Cameron heal, even from wounds that extensive? And how was that even possible when she was offline? Was she running on a battery or something? She and Ellison had picked up Savannah from her school gymnastics class without incident, and the three of them had driven through LA in their newly acquired second-hand car, whilst Sarah made sure nobody was following them. The adage she'd drilled into John was as true now as it ever had been. No one is ever safe. She almost wished it was a Terminator after them. They were relentless and unstoppable, but at least there was only one of them. They had no idea who or how many people could be after them. Every man and woman on the street could be with Kaliba. Is this really necessary? Ellison asked as he handed Sarah a box of thermite powder. Sarah stepped forward and shook the box out over Cameron's body, sprinkling the powder over the deactivated cyborg. We burnt every single machine we took out to wipe any trace of them. If someone gets a single piece, it might hasten Judgment Day. We can't let them get their hands on the body. Ellison shook his head doubtfully and looked down at Cameron's body, covered in a thin sprinkling of powder. They already have machines with them, he answered. We saw one machine working with them. Who knows how many more they have? Is burning Cameron really going to make a difference? Sarah knew that deep down there was more to it than just that. Cameron had caused her so much pain, stress, and trouble since John's birthday. She'd wanted for so long to blow Cameron away and burn her down to ash, but she'd known John would never have forgiven her for it. But John was gone, and she didn't see him ever coming back. Time travel was one way. No one ever came back. Nobody goes home, and nobody else comes through. John was gone, and she blamed Cameron completely for it. His feelings for her were made horribly clear when he'd gone after her. She'd never admit it to anyone, but it was personal as much as anything else. She needed this. Sarah took a Zippo lighter, flicked it on, and extended her arm out towards Cameron's thermite-covered body. She held it there and took a moment to watch the tiny flickering blue flame emanating from the lighter. Such a small, innocuous device, but it suddenly weighed heavily on her. What if John came back somehow? What if he found Cameron's chip and found a way home? To have come all that way to then find out she'd destroyed the body, leaving him back at square one. She tried to harden her resolve, to tell herself that John wasn't coming back. Kyle had told her that time travel was one way. He's not coming back, she told herself. He'd gone to the future, and she had to make sure the hellish future which they'd been trying to prevent didn't happen, to make sure that John didn't find himself in a world dominated by machines. Still, she hesitated. What if by some miracle John did make it back? They'd defied the odds so many times before. What was once more? But then, what if Kaliba got their hands on the body? Burning Cameron was the right thing to do, and she knew it. The decision was easy. It was the consequences that were the hard part. You okay? Ellison asked her. She'd held the lighter over Cameron's body for several seconds without making a move. You want me to do it? No, I'm good, Sarah replied. She looked once more at Cameron's form as she made her mind up. I'm sorry, John, she whispered as her grip on the lighter loosened. What are you doing? Savannah opened the basement door and walked up to the thermite bath. Sarah gripped the lighter harder and flicked the lid back on, extinguishing the flame as she pulled it back towards her. Go back to bed, Sarah told her softly. She didn't want the little girl to see her do this. She'd never understand. Savannah shook her head slowly. I'm not tired. She looked into the concrete block chamber and saw Cameron laid inert inside. She didn't seem fazed at all by the metal skull showing through the gaping wounds in Cameron's face. Sarah assumed it was from being around the other machine all the time. Is she sleeping? Savannah asked. Yes, Ellison said to her, not knowing what else to say. How did you tell a 7-year-old girl that they were going to burn a machine that looked like a person that she probably saw as a person into a puddle of molten metal? She's sleeping. Is she like John Henry? Yeah, I suppose she is. Is she asleep because she doesn't have a cord in her head? Sarah smiled sadly at Savannah's comment. She wished John could have kept some of that innocence. When he was Savannah's age, she already had him learning how to strip down and clean assault rifles, and all his bedtime stories involved metal monsters and the end of the world. She couldn't tell this little girl all that. No child should have to live with the knowledge that John had. She'd always hated herself for having to put him through his life, for him never being able to live normally. She didn't want that for Savannah. Go to bed, and Mr. Ellison will tell you a bedtime story, she told Savannah. Ellison looked at her quizzically, the expression on his face telling her he was out of his depth with kids. She gave him a look back, silently telling him to get Savannah away. I'll finish up here, she told him. Savannah took Ellison's hand, and he led her up the stairs and out of the basement, leaving Sarah alone. She took out the lighter once more but one look at Cameron's body, and she couldn't even bring herself to flick the top up. She held it out, but her hands were trembling. With her other hand, she peeled the top up and held her thumb on the top to ignite it, but she hesitated to flick it on. "Come on, Sarah. You smoked for 3 years in Pescadero. Just flick the lighter on like you've done 1,000 times before." She tried several times before she managed to light it. Her hands were shaking that much. Finally, she had it, but she was still trembling. "Fuck." With a roar of anger, she turned away from Cameron's body and threw the lighter with everything she had, launching it into the wall. She couldn't do it to John, not if there was the tiniest chance he might actually find Cameron's chip in the future. "I hate you," she growled through clenched teeth at the inert cyborg, then stormed up the stairs and out of the basement. She marched through the hallway, practically stamping her feet on the floor, and towards Ellison's kitchen at the back of the house. Sarah pulled open the cupboards and systematically searched for a drink. Whiskey, vodka, anything flammable would do. She pulled half the contents of his kitchen out onto the worktops and left no stone unturned, but found nothing. She was still shaking with pent-up anger when she opened the fridge and found 6 bottles of some imported beer she'd never heard of on the bottom shelf. Not exactly what she was after, but it was the best she could find, and she wasn't about to risk a trip outside to a liquor store. She pulled one out and searched the drawers for a bottle opener, her hands trembling with anger as she swept various utensils roughly and noisily around, eventually finding one and snatching it out. She tore the cap off the bottle, pulled it to her lips and downed the whole thing in one go, gulping the beer down in a matter of seconds. Sarah slammed the bottle down on the worktop and sighed loudly as the alcohol took effect rapidly and started to calm her nerves. She pulled a second bottle out, opened it, and this time sipped slowly. "God damn you, you metal bitch." Ellison sat on the side of his spare bed and looked down at the tiny form of Savannah Weaver, snuggled under the bed covers and clearly tired, despite her earlier claims. He ran one hand down her bright red hair, smoothing it out and soothing her. "Where's Mommy?" she asked. Ellison almost choked on the question. He knew he should have been prepared for it, but the events of the day had been so overwhelming that he'd barely had time to think about it. What was he supposed to say to her? How could he tell a little girl that what she thought was her mother was actually a liquid metal robot in disguise? Judging from his own machine lookalike that tried to kill him on his doorstep, the liquid metal had probably killed the real Catherine Weaver, or at least taken advantage of her death. He wondered if Lachlan Weaver had really been alone when he died in the helicopter crash, and what the cause of said accident had really been. "She had to go on a little business trip," Ellison said hesitantly, hoping he sounded more convincing than he felt. "When will she be back?" "I don't know, soon. But she told me and Sarah to take care of you while she's gone." He paused before deciding to add something else. "And she told me to tell you she loves you very much." Savannah smiled and sank a little further under the covers. "Who's Sarah?" Savannah asked. She recognized her as one of the people who'd saved her from the bad man who'd broken into her house, but she didn't know who she was, and she'd been told not to trust strangers. "She's a friend. She's helping me out with a few things." Savannah nodded, satisfied. She liked Mr. Ellison, so if Sarah was a friend of his, then she must be nice too. "Where's the boy who helped me tie my shoes?" Savannah asked. He'd saved her too, so had the girl who was asleep in the basement with Sarah. "He's with your mom," Ellison replied. Technically, that was the only part of his story that wasn't a lie. He knew it wouldn't hold forever. One day Savannah would realize her mommy wasn't coming back, and then what would he tell her? He stood up off the side of the bed and stepped away, feeling uncomfortable around Savannah all of a sudden now he'd lied to her. He felt dirty because of the secret he was keeping. "I'm going to go talk with Sarah. Are you okay here?" Savannah nodded and closed her eyes as she settled into the pillows beneath her head. Good night, Mr. Ellison. Good night, Savannah. Sweet dreams. He turned the light off and closed the door behind him as he left the room, hating himself for telling her Weaver was going to come back. Ellison descended the stairs and headed into the kitchen, finding Sarah sat at his table with 3 empty beer bottles on the table and a 4th, half full, in her hands. Good idea, he said to himself and pulled one out of the fridge. He sat down opposite Sarah and opened his own bottle, taking a swig from it before putting it down and looking at her. Hell of a day, he commented. Sarah just grunted and gave a slight nod as she brought her beer to her lips and took a long gulp. Hell of a day, she repeated his words hollowly. I don't suppose you have anything stronger. I checked, but didn't find anything. I don't really drink much, Ellison told her. Few beers every now and then, that's about it. Sorry, he shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly. Did you do it? Ellison turned his head and gestured towards the door, leading down to the basement. Couldn't, she sighed sadly. She sorely wished she could have burnt Cameron down and been done with it. We'll have to find somewhere to hide her then, Ellison replied calmly. Sarah put her bottle down and leaned back in her chair, keeping one elbow on the table and her hand close to the beer. She looked Ellison straight in the eyes, wanting to see his reaction to what she had to ask. Did you know? About what? Ellison asked, confused. Weaver, did you know what she was this whole time? I found out the exact same moment you did, Ellison replied. He still could barely believe it. What the hell was she, anyway? You never mentioned anything like that on the tapes from Pescadero. Sarah believed him. Ellison wasn't one of the bad guys. He was just constantly in the wrong place at the wrong time. It seemed like he was as much fated to their fight against Skynet as she and John were. T-1000, Sarah replied, remembering Ellison knew only pieces of the story, what was on the official reports plus what he'd seen in recent months. He probably had a gist of the big picture, but she needed him to see all of it. Though after recent events, she wasn't too sure if even she knew it all anymore. Liquid metal. That's what the machine that helped John break me out back in '97 called it. It can imitate anything it touches, and they're almost impossible to kill. It took a vat of molten steel to kill the last one. And now it's in the future with John. Could have been her plan all along. Sarah shook her head, knowing what Ellison was thinking. No, these things don't mess around. If it wanted John dead, it would have killed us the moment we stepped into Zyra Corp, and there wouldn't have been much we could have done about it. Sarah took a final swig of her beer and gulped it down. It had helped her nerves and stopped her shaking, at least. She longed for something stronger, wanting to get shit-faced drunk to try and numb the pain of losing her son to the future, to the very machine that lay inert downstairs. So what do we do now? Ellison wasn't afraid to admit he hadn't a clue what to do next, what they even wanted to do or what their aim was now. I promised John I'd stop it. Sarah pushed the bottle away from her, her anger and deep sense of loss moving aside whilst an iron-cast determination took over. The same urge that had sent her alone against Miles Dyson and pushed her to do whatever it took to protect her son. So we're going to stop it. She breathed out, and her eyes sank, suddenly deflated as she realized their prospects. But I don't know how with just the two of us. We don't have anything anymore. No guns, no explosives, no supply drop. And all my contacts are dead. Ellison smiled slightly in response, as an idea suddenly came to him. He leaned forward over the table, his elbows resting on the rich, dark wood as he locked eyes with Sarah. Then we'll try mine. Danny sat at his laptop in the basement room, as he had been for what seemed like an eternity now. His fingers danced over the keyboard, and streams of information scrolled down the screen rapidly. Danny's eyes rapidly moved from left to right as he took in all the information. Time became non-existent, as he found himself absorbed by the data before him. An AI had definitely been developed here. If the server farms weren't enough, there were the myriad files he'd uncovered that detailed the growth and development of an entity. The problem was he couldn't find any trace of it now. It was gone, vanished. At first, he'd thought it was simply offline because of the blackout. But after accessing several files on the hard drives in the room's computers, he knew that wasn't the case. It was as if the AI had just vanished into thin air. If that wasn't enough, he had no idea what the hell the computer terminals that had been shot up were for. They clearly had something to do with Zyracorp's AI, but what exactly, he had no clue. Coffee. Noel's voice tore Danny's attention away from the screen, and he looked behind him towards the burly mercenary, hand held out with a steaming plastic cup in his fingers. Danny took the drink from Noel's and sipped at the piping hot liquid. Just crap from one of the vending machines. Thanks, he replied. Any progress? Noel's asked him. Some, I think. I went through the security footage, and there's something interesting, Noel's said to the younger man. He handed a sheet of paper over to his opposite. Danny took the sheet and saw a picture on it. Catherine Weaver in the lobby with a tall, bald black man in a suit and two other people. A teenage boy a few years younger than himself, and... It can't be, Danny whispered, but he knew machines didn't lie. Sarah Connor, the woman who'd broken into his home and led his father to his death. What's she doing here? He asked himself. Sarah Connor, that crazy woman from the TV, Noel's needlessly explained. I'm guessing that's her son John, he added. Noel's looked around to check none of his men were nearby, then leaned down to Danny's ear. Do you know what we're doing here? He asked Danny. He'd been a regular Marine, not used to black ops or anything of the like. He didn't like all this secrecy and cloak and dagger stuff. Trying to access Zyracorp's AI, Danny replied. You know that. Yeah, but something just doesn't feel right. Noel sat down next to him. He reckoned the kid knew something he wasn't letting on. AI, cyborgs, Sarah Connor. I'd bet 10 years' pay against a turd that this isn't just industrial espionage. He'd heard a lot of stories about Sarah Connor, a crazy woman who attacked computer companies because she thought machines would take over the world. What the hell was the CEO of Zyracorp doing meeting with her? I don't know, Danny quickly said, shooting Noel's an irritated look. His mind was elsewhere right now, on the photo of Sarah Connor and her son. They pay me to access this AI, and for you to do whatever they ask you. You're ex-military, right? Marines for 18 years, Noel's nodded. So you understand need to know, Danny concluded. If you need to know more, I'll tell you. Noel's glared at Danny, not particularly happy being spoken down to by some brat barely out of college. 18 years in the Corps, and he'd known plenty of dickhead junior officers, just like Danny Dyson, fresh out of training and thinking they knew it all. The kid would get a major shock one day. He got up out of his seat and left the room, deliberately bumping Danny's shoulder with the butt of his rifle on the way out. Danny watching him leave and waited until he heard the fire door leading to the stairs close, then pulled out his cell phone and pressed the first number on his speed dial. Yes. The voice on the other end answered. Do you have the AI? Not yet, Danny said. He could picture the man on the other end, scowling at the news. His employers, he'd found, weren't the most understanding of people. The AI seems to have vanished. There's no trace of it, but we've located what I believe to be the hardware that housed it. Do you want me to bring it back? A pause. Again, Danny tried to imagine his employer, clad in an expensively tailored suit and sat in a leather chair behind a plush wooden desk, cigarette permanently in his hand, releasing a haze of smoke into the room that clung to the ceiling and the walls. Danny hated the smell of it, but his boss never seemed to be without a cigarette in his hand or his mouth. He pictured the man taking a long drag as he composed his reply. No. Learn everything you can from it, then destroy it. I don't want any trace of it left. A shame, Danny thought. He'd have loved to have seen the difference between this phantom, AI, and the one he'd helped develop. Still, he knew he wasn't being paid to satisfy his own curiosity. There's been another development, he reported. Weaver's missing, but we've seen security footage of her with Sarah Connor. They had a meeting, I don't know what about. Again, there was another pause. Danny wondered if the man was alone, or whether his associates were present on the other end. Were they debating what to do with this new information? Don't concern yourself with Sarah Connor, Mr. Dyson. I know what she did to your father, but don't let it distract you. We'll handle the Connors. This time Danny was the one to hesitate. He'd sorely wanted to get his own back on Sarah after she killed his father. He made more than enough money working for Kaliba. He'd even entertained the idea of hiring Knowles and his men to track her down and kill her. Understood, he said, reluctantly brushing aside all thoughts of getting even with Sarah Connor. His revenge fantasies would have to remain just that. I'll have the last laugh, he thought to himself. People like her just didn't seem to understand you couldn't stop progress. Like the rising sun, it was inevitable.